History. If a history of Hungarian philosophy in the early modern age will be written someday in the future, Transylvanian anti-Trinitarian critic of religion will obtain a crucial key position in such an undertaking. Taking a look at the parallel endeavors within the context of Czech or Polish culture, a history of the universities of Prague or Krakow can and does serve as a serious background for their historiography of philosophy. The initiatives for grounding universities in medieval Hungary could not survive the era of King Matthias Corvinus. However, this lack of the highest institution for philosophical discourse did not result in the absence of loving wisdom. The fact that the majority of the medieval kingdom of Hungary was occupied by the Turks meant a predominantly disadvantageous milieu for deeper intellectual reflections, but insofar as it impeded, but only insofar as it impeded the establishment of intellectual institutions, above all universities. On the other hand, the very fact of the presence of the Turks supported other forms of perceptions of a different kind of culture. These immediate perceptions had certainly their impact on thinking about religious matters. Regarding anti-Trinitarian intellectuals, or at least a particular group of them, of the time, this impact was philosophical in its nature. Transylvania's leading anti-Trinitarian intellectuals have never shared the strong anti-philosophical attitude of the mainstreams of Protestantism. Philosophy proved to be at least ambivalent at the very moment of the birth of Unitarian thinking here. There is an unmistakable tendency for a differentiation between wanting scholastic philosophical treatments of Trinity and critique against it with philosophical background already in the famous publication of the De Falsat Vera in 1568. The situation was complicated. Miguel Servet's modernistic conception of Trinity proved to be too philosophical for Franciscus David's denominational taste. It had to be amended by letting out certain moments. There's the moments of the tradition of philosophical Platonism. The ethical setting of David's religious thinking necessitated no supplementation of Servet's Platonic philosophy. But the aftermath, especially in the 1580s and 1590s, felt a need of philosophical tools for critiquing the doctrine of Trinity. Their paradigmatic orientation was accordingly Aristotelian. The reason for telling this long story is that medieval Arabic philosophy was received within the framework of a broader Aristotelian tradition. Working on radical theological matters in the late 16th century, Transylvania had a double and ambivalent background. One cannot deny the importance of the immediate experience of religious presence of Islam, considering the holistic critique of central theological issues of contemporary Christianity. But at the same time, it was an inner development of Western Protestantism which turned the anti-Trinitarians' interest to Arabic philosophy in the broader context of Aristotelian tradition of Western philosophy. Before I came to the point of my lecture, I would like to give two examples of using Arabic scholars. For the first example, I refer to György Enyedi's work, explication of some notes in the New and Old Testament, published in Kolozsvár, Cluj, 1598, a masterpiece of anti-Trinitarian exegetics, which was read widely in the 17th century Europe. Enyedi refers to Zabarella and to Averroes while treating the problem of essential equality between the two first persons of Trinity. I jump over this, these lines, and I would like to say that Enyedi's use of Arabic philosophical tradition is a purely scholarly one. He simply takes advantage of a peripatetic line of thought concerning the principle of individuation. The essence of Christ and essence of God cannot be identical with each other because because of the principle of individuation. Okay, my second example comes from a certain Christian Franken, a German philosopher and religious refugee in Transylvania. While teaching philosophy in the anti-Trinitarian school in Cluj between 1589 and 91, he wrote a work which went beyond every confessional bound of the period. The disputation about the incertitude of Christian religion between a philosopher and a theologue. This work provides us not only with doubt concerning the eminency of Christianity among other religions, but undertakes to undermine the rational claims supporting the superiority of each religion from a perspective of a holistic atheism. By publishing the only copy of the work handed down to us, I argued that Franken's disputation is the first explicitly atheistic text of the history of European philosophy. This time, of course, I cannot go into details of Franken's critique of rational theology. Instead, I pick out one argument with its refutation for the eminency of Christianity, the one, namely, which attempts to prove the preeminence of Christianity against Islam. The argument is based on Avicenna's rational critique against the popular theology of his own religion. The sensible notions of Islamic paradise cannot fulfill the criteria of Avicenna's rationalism. Therefore, Avicenna and now Christian apologetics, therefore Islam stands on a lower level of rationality than Christianity, which is much more compatible with a moderate rationalism. This is an old and well-known polemic argument for Christian superiority against Islam. Franken takes it over from Duns Scotus' Oxford Commentary of Sentences. Besides other motives, the refutation of the argument presupposes a common shared theological status or for justification for both Christians and Muslims. It states that the nature of human being does not consist only in its rationality, and that not even Christianity is able to pass rational criticism. Avicenna's inner rational critique of Islamic theology is used for polemical Christian purposes. The argument for the contrary view is built on the concept of natural religion common to all members of mankind with the same anthropology. Franken regarded the idea of a common theological status of Christians and Muslims not as the last instance of his thinking on religious matters, as arguments for natural or universal religion and for the God of this religion are also subjective to his atheistic criticism. Nevertheless, the notion of a common theological status of Christians and Muslims was an effective tool to disapprove claims for the eminency of special religions. This idea of the equal status of Christians and Muslims concerning justification was not Franken's own invention. His novelty consisted in the instrumental exploitation of this syncretic idea against claims of religious superiority in the context of an atheistic argumentation. It was indeed the Greek Jacobus Paleologus, the main figure of my lecture, whose universalistic or syncretic theology could have motivated the German philosopher's counter-argument. Paleologus' life is well documented in the studies concentrating on the history of religious free thought in 16th century Eastern Europe. The main motives of his adventurous biography are escaping from inquisition, political agency, or even spying. From the 1570s on, Paleologus stayed in Poland, Transylvania, and Moravia, and went on a journey to Chios, the Greek island where he was born, and Istanbul. He wrote his famous works between 1571 and 76, while having strong connections with Polish and Transylvanian anti-Trinitarian intellectuals. Although the religious climate of his time was not favorable for the publication of his chief works, they were available in handwritten copies widely in Eastern Europe. Paleologus was captured following imperial command in Moravia in 1581 and was extradited to Rome, where he was beheaded and burnt in 1585. The work, about which I would like to give a short expose, contains perhaps the clearest summary of his syncretic theology. It bears the title De Tribus Gentibus and the Three Nations. Paleologus finished the essay in Krakow in 1572. The only preserved manuscript is dated on 1587 in Toda, Transylvania by Máté Torockai. The text of the tractate, published by Leszczewski in 1972, is based on this manuscript. Paleologus begins his essay with an apodictic statement. All men, by nature, desire to seek and to acquire salvation. Salvation, which substitutes Aristotle's knowledge in this paraphrase of the first sentence of the Metaphysics, is twofold. First, it is the object of a basic instinct in every member of mankind without exception. Paleologus states that this instinct is a strong anthropological motive. Although this desire can be satisfied neither by any sensual nor by any mental knowledge, its origin is nevertheless natural. Second, there is an other salvation, altera salus, which was based by God on this salvation and on this desire. It is the figure of Abraham that plays a decisive role in the history of spreading out of this altera salus. With Abraham, mankind acquires knowledge about the second salvation and raises institutions to serve God, who provides mankind with the hope of acquiring it. Although the pagan Greeks and Romans had some undetermined notions of the second salvation in the form of their public patriotism as well, Abraham's descendants enjoy special privileges. At the same time, non-Jewish nations perceive the preeminent status of the Jews, and some of them try to enter God's elected nation through the ritual of circumcision. According to Paleologus, there were two types of human existence that had the notion, hope, and desire of second salvation before Christ: Abraham's descendants and those non-Jews who subjected themselves to the act of circumcision in order to join the elected nation. Patriotism without circumcision assured only a weak sign of the altera salus, especially for the Greeks, who were Greek patriots in public, but nevertheless conducted a vicious life in their private sphere. The situation changed with Christ's appearance in the world, but not in the traditional sense. Those non-Jews who originally had no other choice to enter the elected nation than to subject themselves to the rite of circumcision were offered the notion of second salvation without undertaking circumcision. The criterion of having knowledge of salvation was not circumcision anymore, but the faith in the fact that Jesus was the Christ, thus God's anointed. However, the occurrence of this faith did not mean the annulment or cancellation of the rights of the Jews. This new notion of salvation propagated by Christ was the very same salvation as the one which had been promised for Abraham's descendants. The key moment of Paleologus' conception is the interpretation of Acts chapter 15 and of the First Synod of Jerusalem concerning the questions of circumcision. Without going into subtle details, we can summarize Paleologus' point of view in his statement that it is not the Jews whose status concerning the salvation changed with Christ's occurrence. Rather, it is the status of the non-Jews that changed. They did not have to subject themselves anymore to the rite of circumcision in order to be part of the elected nation, that is, to have the appropriate notion of the salvation. It is a practically intolerant and exegetically untenable opinion that the requirement of setting aside the rights of the Jews is an unavoidable presupposition for their salvation and justification according to Christian faith. What's more, a non-Jewish person can even disregard God's newly provided notion of salvation through undertaking circumcision and joining Abraham's descendants without losing the very same perspective on the very same salvation. But after having him subjected to the rite, he has to fulfill the ceremonial prescriptions of the Jews and cannot draw upon his faith only. Jews and Christians all have their own perspective of the same salvation. Christianity can be explained without cancelling Jewish ceremonies, and Jewish ceremonies can be justified without negating the central role of Christ. So far, so good. But what about the Turks? As the title of the tractate on the three nations already suggests, Paralogus leads the third nation into his syncretism too. First of all, the Alcoran acknowledges Jesus as Christ as well, performing the minimal requirement for the salvation for the Gentiles. They practice the act of circumcision, but on the contrary to the Jews, there is no sign of the deadline of the 8th day. They circumcise boys only after a certain age and justify this right through some causes relating to corporal hygiene. After all, the circumcision of the Muslims is a question of comparative studies of religions, as it appears by Herodotus or Diodorus Siculus. May these resources of antiquity suggest that the ancestors of the third nation had received the ritual circumcision from the Jews long before being Muslims. It has nevertheless no impact on sharing their notion of the other salvation. Their status is the same as that of the non-circumcised non-Jews. They are provided with the notion and the hope of salvation by recognizing Jesus Christ. Paralogus refuses the standard polemical commonplace of the absurdities contained in the Alcoran through relating similar phenomena in the text of Christian revelation, and enforces his view by emphasizing a possible genetic relationship between them. Muslims are in fact descendants of nations who lived in geographical proximity to the scenes of Christ's coming. Therefore, they were promised with a hope of salvation in the same manner as other Gentiles who were not Jews. According to his famous view, Paralogus sees the cause of their departure from Christianity in the fact that they were averse from accepting the doctrines of the Holy Trinity and the essential divine nature of Christ as late developments of so-called Christian theology. According to Lech-Chulsky, this radical syncretism has only very rare parallels in contemporary Europe. One of the similar cases is Graham Postal's. Although Postal and Paralogus had a painful opportunity to get acquainted with each other in the prison of the Inquisition in Rome in 1559, the Polish scholar denies a direct takeover of Postal's thought. I think he's right. In accordance with Chulsky's view, I would like to investigate other forms of thinking about syncretism in the early modern age, without being certain that my orientation leads to results which account exhaustively for the immediate intellectual setting of Paralogus' syncretism. I would like to consider his thinking from the perspective of the philosophy of religion in the early modern age and the later Middle Age. While facing religious dissent resulting from the factual diversity of religions, authors of early modernity preferred to construct a metaphysical background accounting for the factual and experience diversity in religious matters. A paradigmatic project of this kind is Nicolaus Cusanus' De Pazza Fide on the Peace of Faith from the year 1453. Cusanus deserves our attention not only because of his treatment of religious diversity, but because it is highly probable that Paralogus might have known Cusanus' work while working on his unpublished essays in Krakow and Cluj, or en route between Poland and Transylvania. The theme and the dialogical structure of Paralogus' Disputatio Scholastica make this hypothesis plausible. This fascinating fiction of the Greek thinker presents a religious dispute on theological matters of Trinity in the heaven, whereas the scene is a stylization of earthly city Cluj. The astonishing fact that the work ends when Cusanus should start his speech in the favor of the blessed Trinity reveals not only Paralogus' acquaintance with him, but surely his dilemmas as well. I abstain from a detailed analysis of Cusanus on a piece of faith, and from its comparison with Paralogus on the three nations. However, the result of a quick comparison is a thoroughly negative already. While Paralogus tells us the united story taken from revealed narrative texts of different religions, Cusanus delineates the philosophical prerequisites of such a unified narrative without telling the story itself. Let's take another starting point, namely Averroes' philosophy of religion. Averroes' philosophy of religion is scattered in his works. Despite the commentary to Plato's state, his most explicit statements are to be found in the last disputation of his famous Incoherence of Incoherence. The theme of the disputation is the theological doctrine of bodily resurrection, but instead of a close treatment of the subject, Averroes highlights the relationship between philosophy and political theology in social context. The doctrine of bodily resurrection is accepted by philosophers because of its social function. Bodily resurrection is a theological doctrine which has a connection to political philosophy. Politics is constitutive for anthropology, therefore political philosophy is able to interpret theological teachings from a natural perspective. In this sense, the competency of philosophy, of practical philosophy indeed, reaches beyond theological and political differences of laws insofar as, I quote, practical virtues can only become strong through the knowledge and adoration of God by the services prescribed by the laws of the different religions, like offerings and prayers and supplications and other such utterances by which praise is rendered to God, the angels and the prophets. Quotation. End of quotation. Therefore, I quote, the philosophers believe that religious laws are necessary political arts, the principles of which are taken from natural reason and inspiration, especially in what is common to all religions, although religions differ here more or less. End of quotation. This line of thought empowers Averroes to delineate a kind of natural history of religions. The social context of religion is determined by three types of mankind: the intellectual elite of the philosophers, the legalist theologians, and the mass. The members of the latter two have clear goals and functions in a political community. Theologians establish laws by referring on the divine origin of the legislative acts, and the mass follows obediently the laws with religious background. The philosophers, on the contrary, have two concerns. First, according to Averroes' philosophical psychology, they have their own philosophical project of leaving behind temporal circumstances and ascending to a philosophical contemplation of God. Second, the philosopher must live in accordance with the laws put in force by the theologians for a given society under temporal conditions. Averroes leans toward a harmonization of these two tendencies. I quote, notwithstanding, we do not find any religion which is not attentive to the special needs of the learned, although it is primarily concerned with things in which the mass participate. End of quotation. What's more, the philosopher must adapt himself to his social context in case of a conflict between philosophical and theological approaches. Quotation, if he expresses a doubt concerning the religious principles in which he has been brought up, or explains them in a way contradictory to the prophets, and turns away from their path, he merits more than anyone else that the term unbeliever should be applied to him, and he is liable to the penalty for unbelief in the religion in which he has been brought up. End of quotation. Instead of placing the emphasis on the conflict situation between theology and philosophy, Averroes highlights the philosopher's ability of adjusting himself to the political laws introduced by the theologians and followed by the mass. The philosopher does not choose the actual religious laws as true ones because he uncritically believes in their supernatural origin, but because politics belongs to the metaphysical deep structure of human being. The philosopher is able to evaluate different religions and social settlements and to select the best of them. This is not only a mere contingent possibility for the intellectual elite, but this selection proves to be the leading motive of Averroes' natural history of religions. Quotation, further, he is under obligation to choose the best religion of his period, even when they are all equally true for him, and he must believe that the best will be abrogated by the introduction of a still better. Therefore, the learned who were instructing the people in Alexandria became Muslims when Islam reached them, and the learned in the Roman Empire became Christians when the religion of Jesus was introduced there. And nobody doubts that among the Israelites there were many learned men, and this is apparent from the books which are found amongst the Israelites which are attributed to Solomon. End of quotation. Thus, Averroes gives a uniform scheme for the expansion of Christianity in Rome and of Islam in Alexandria, and even for the outspread of Jewish religion among the Israelites. The key of his conception is his anthropology involving political existence, which can be philosophically interpreted without taking into consideration theological topics peculiar to special religions. What is the relationship between Cusanus and Averroes' views on the one side and Paralogus' views on the other side? Paralogus was probably acquainted with Cusanus' De Parts Fide, but it is hard to imagine that the theological implications of the German thinker's work were to his taste. Averroes, like Cusanus, develops his narrative of revelation against a philosophical background, but unlike Cusanus, he unfolds this narrative much more historically. In this respect, Averroes' laconic remark about the conversion of Alexandrian and Roman people to Islam and Christianity respectively has much more resemblance to Paralogus' conception concerning the same status in both of these religions. Although Averroes tells his reader nothing about the Alexandrians' previous religion before their conversion, their perspective to salvation had been obviously granted before the Muslims' religion reached them. Religions converge along some common shared standards of religious history. Paralogus' common history of religion rests on philosophical presuppositions as well. Nevertheless, his philosophical prerequisites are much more moderate than those of Cusanus or of Averroes. Paralogus bases his narrative on the natural instinctual desire of human being towards salvation. This is an unmistakably Aristotelian point of view and is very opposite to Cusanus' a priori notion of God. Averroes' Alexandrians might have had the Aristotelian natural instinct of salvation. Regarding Averroes, the main difference of Paralogus' intention lies in the anthropological emphasis within their common shared Aristotelism, while Paralogus accentuates the importance of individual desire on a factional level. Averroes' main anthropological concern is with political existence, but both make very similar things possible, a possibly common narrative for the Greek monotheistic religions. Thank you for your attention.
The central figures of my paper, Erasmus Iohannis, Minister of Saxon Community, and György Enyedi, who served the Hungarian nation, so it is probably worthwhile to take a look at the context in which their rival careers evolved, with some accent on two nations' commonwealth in Kolozsvár, Klausenburg, today Cluj-Napoca. 19th century nationalistic, or let we say patriotistic Hungarian historiography established a link between the city's turn towards Unitarianism.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you speak up a little bit? They cannot hear in the back.
Louder. And the growing of the Hungarian ethnic group, but this has been refuted by recent scholarship. In fact, it is all the more remarkable how the conflicts between different ethnic groups, Saxons and Hungarian, could avoid confessional struggle. Probably the best documented episode of this is a case from 1568, when the Hungarians gave voice to certain offenses covering ecclesiastical matters. But even then, theological and dogmatic questions were absent. Yet, as mitigation for the offenses, they could procure a decree from the principle according to which a certain balanced rotating management was introduced, and this touched upon these ecclesiastical matters as well. Therefore, the rector, the leader of the school, was not selected exclusively from the Saxons, but from the Hungarians too, and during the term of the Hungarian judge of the city, they were authorized to use the main temple too. Something similar happened in terms of education. According to the order, a Hungarian rector had to be followed by a Saxon rector by election, and the lector must always be selected from the opposite natio to the rector. Since the position of the plebanus, chief minister of the city, was filled by the absolute bilingual Ferenc Dávid, and his natural bilingualism was shared by the principals of the city as well, no major conflict emerged when the orders were introduced. For the next 2 decades, there are no records of more serious disputes, and during the polemic between different versions of anti-Trinitarianism belonging to either of these nations apparently played no role. Hungarians and Saxons are found among the radical non-adherentists and their opponents alike. However, in 1592, the situation profoundly changed with the death of Demeter Hunyadi, who was not only the chief minister of the city after the death of Ferenc Dávid, but also the bishop of the Unitarian Church. The two nations engaged in a rivalry, also extending to dogmatic questions, when the synod enacted a decree according to which the chief minister and the bishop of the church had to be the same person, as it happened to be in the previous 2 cases, and elected as the bishop the Hungarian György Enyedi, who, based on his later writings, seemed to be close to the Christology adopted by Ferenc Dávid in his last years. The Saxon congregation, however, insisted that the plebanus should be elected from their nation, and since the Hungarians found their further candidates inept, they were really not too well-educated people, a long debate ensued where the Saxons were intractably holding to Erasmus Johannis, who had been in the city since 1588. Even if previously only the institutions and the keeping of common usage was controlled, from this time on, this was complemented with dogmatic friction as well. It must be noted here that before coming to Transylvania, Erasmus Johannis, who worked earlier in Emden, Frankfurt am Main, and Antwerp as schoolmaster, was also involved in Christological debates with Fausto Sozzini in Krakow. During the debate, it turned out that although he didn't accept the concept of Trinity, he remained unconvinced by Fausto's arguments for the pre-existence of Christ. The Saxon congregation could put across their intention. Erasmus Johannis was elected as plebanus in 1593, but an entry in the city council's protocol noted that in some articles of faith, the elected represents a position differing from the synods. So the Saxons seem to distance themselves from dogmatic radicalism, but we can only make guesses about the further political motives involved in the case. It is certain, nonetheless, that non-adherentism eliminated all ties between anti-Trinitarianism and other denominations, whereas the position represented by Erasmus Johannis promised the survival of these ties. Earlier criticism already hinted at these conflicts, and it also appeared likely that the Saxon minister formulated individual views in eschatological questions as well, but these were at best reconstructed from the titles, since his manuscripts were lost. A sense of strong prophetic determination emerges from 3 titles listed in the 18th century church history, which promised to discuss the events of the final times. He wrote an allegedly extensive commentary on the Apocalypse. He is the author of a tract about the 4 monarchies, Liber de Quator Monarchies, and he also wrote a separate tract which predicted the fall of the Mohammedans. The church history also recorded that this latter work's dedication to the reader was written in 1586. However, the recently published correspondence of Beza contains an exchange of letters between the great Genevan reformer and him from 1593, which provides new insights into his views about the end of times. The exchange was facilitated by the Central European envoy of the Genevian Church, Charles Lefort, who was asked by Erasmus Ioannis to deliver a letter. Beza's exceptionally rough answer clearly rejects any form of cooperation, but we don't know whether the Saxon Plebanus did ever receive it. Of course, the rejection comes as no surprise. Probably more remarkable is Erasmus Ioannis' prophetic zeal and eagerness. Referring to their earlier cooperation, he in fact makes an attempt at converting Beza and claims that in a personal meeting he would certainly be convinced about the inevitable rejection of the traditional dogma of the Trinity, as it was a consistent evaluation of Reformation doctrines which led him to the truth now promoted in Kolozsvár. This truth will also be justified by imminent events, since mankind stands before historic changes. Opposed to earlier times, no unfounded prophecies will be imposed upon people. Now is the time when the events mentioned formerly by Wolfgang Capito are bound to take place. Israel, that is, the Jews, are going to be converted, which means that all the final events, as described in the 11th chapter of the letter to the Romans, are going to occur. The letter provides no details about this, but contains an attached short notice, which was written by him earlier in 1586 in the house of András Dudic. Here we read that the final days will bring along a decisive battle between the followers of Christ and Muhammad. This will end with the collapse of Muhammad's empire, therefore everyone must refrain from seeking the support of the Turks. Until then, however, we must be silent about all this in order to avoid hurting the divine truth by speaking before the events. So we must wait silently, knowing that the heavenly will soon act through a succession of strikes upon the infidel, gather the just unto one folk, and by doing away with sects and idolatry, create order and harmony in church and politics alike. Of course, there is no detailed political concept behind the thoughts of Erasmus Ioannis. Since the first version of the vision about the end of times was drafted as early as 1586, it is impossible to suggest that these were written in the service of Prince Zsigmond Bátory's politics, who already joined the anti-Turkish League. It is also impossible to fit the more individual aspects of the fervent visions into such a concept, although the basic constituents, above all the conversion of the Jews, were standard elements of chiastic thinking, elements on which Wolfgang Capito also relied, whose De Operibus Dei was used by Transylvanian Unitarians already in the 1560s. At the same time, it is true that while political overtones are possible in Erasmus Ioannis' thinking, in the case of the Flemish Eberhard Spangenberg, such motives can be almost completely excluded. The situation is dimmed, however, by the fact that Spangenberg's ideas are only known indirectly from Socini's refutation. We know that he was the author of a work about the beasts of the Apocalypse, Theses de Duabus Bestis ex Apocalypsi, and another which was about the fall of the Roman Church. From Socini's reply, it is clear that the author, who stayed in Transylvania from 1591 to 1596, wrote 2 letters to Fausto in the spring of 1596, in which he discussed the imminent restoration of all things. When interpreting these visions, which were drafted by foreigners staying in Transylvania for a shorter or longer period, it must be kept in mind that the search for similar visions among Hungarian Unitarians would be in vain. It is widely known that Matthias Veheglirius, who stayed in Transylvania in the years 1578-79, developed the chiastic concept within his German work, Matanya. He propagated the idea that in the 20th chapter of Apocalypse, John describes the earthly empire of Christ at the second coming. This earthly realm will last for 1,000 years, but its imminence is beyond our knowledge. So, according to him, the events of the final times also contain the 1,000-year earthly reign, and only after that does the final judgment commence, after which Christ hands back the power to the Father and becomes one among the believers, rejoicing in eternal bliss. This concept found its followers mostly among the Sabbatarians in Transylvania, but the intensity of expectation was gradually decreasing, and they less and less tended to count with its immediate occurrence. Similarly, the debate between Pál Korady and Miklós Bogáti Fazekas, which went back to the early 1580s, had also ended. In his extensive commentary on the Apocalypse, Korady used Glirius and Serviet's text in a peculiar way to argue for the inevitability of the 1,000-year reign, whereas Bogáti relied on Paleologus to refute this in his Apocalypse commentary. A passionate debate emerged between them, which was confined to theology and, in a certain sense, rather esoteric, as no arguments connected to politics were employed on either side. This was so because Korady did not actualize the 1,000-year reign, neither did he link its advent to a specific time, and never said that it is imminent. On the other hand, contrary to Erasmus Johannis, his eschatological and chiastic thinking was always clearly rooted in Christology. The question was urging, as Christ could not fulfill his messianic rule due to the Jews' obstinacy, whereas the Holy Scripture explicitly regards this as his mission and talks distinctly about the realization of his reign. From the perspective of our conference, it is particularly important that Korady, who builds on Serviet and Glirius alike, does not identify the little horn in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, with the Turk. Obviously referring to Melanchthon and other theologians from Wittenberg, he explains that all those eminent scholars are mistaken who think that the little horn alludes to the Turk. They fail to consider that the Roman Empire was demolished long before the appearance of Mohammed. At the same time, it must also be considered that the Turks were never part of the Roman Empire. The concept is complete with the idea that Rome will not be destroyed by the Turks, but the 10 horns of the beast from the 17th chapter of Apocalypse, the kingdom which originally were satellites of Rome, but rather grew hatred towards it and destroyed it. A truly intriguing demythization of the Turks can be observed here, since the concept suggests that their acts are kept within boundaries, which means that there is no reason to fear that they would conquer the whole of Western Europe. As the next important element of this demythization, Korady explains that in the Apocalypse 20th book, it is a mistake to identify Gog with the Turks and Magog with the Islamized people who joined the Turks. He argues that the interpretation should return to the original sense of the words. Gog means with tabernacle, Magog means without tabernacle. So the text in fact says that all the folks of the earth will gather. This demythicization is important because it also argues with the views of the probably most resolute opponent of anti-Trinitarianism, Milius, the Hungarian Calvinist preacher. It is rather interesting that the Calvinist, who liked to talk about the anti-Trinitarian's Turkish Christ, was in this sense pro-Turk, as he claimed that Hungarians and Turks are both descendants of Gog, which means that they are relatives. As it was already mentioned, these concepts triggered fervent debates among the different groups of anti-Trinitarians in the 1580s, but they were dropped by the 1590s. The anti-Trinitarians adhering to the heritage of Ferenc David followed the path which was probably trodden first by Benedek Óváry, who built upon Glerius in order to argue that if at his first coming Christ was unable to establish his reign due to the blindness and the stubbornness of the Jews, then he will realize it at his second coming, and this monarchy will last for 1,000 years. Thus, the work by and large follows Pál Karádi's argument. Nonetheless, it ends with the advice that the believers are not supposed to contemplate too much about this issue, but should always keep in mind that this world is coming to an end, and they should prepare themselves with a pure life and the following of Christ to that new world where truth will reign forever. György Enyedi was another representative of this trend, and he eventually succeeded in tempering the enthusiastic expectations. This trend was also present in his erudite explicaciones already mentioned, but among his contemporaries, his polemic writings and sermons were more influential. The numerous manuscripts preserving his sermons testify to their popularity. One could cite many passages where he tries to moderate the enthusiasm, but here I would like to restrict myself to his comment on Psalm 2. Here he argues that because of the extraordinarily fierce debate about this text, it is an appropriate vehicle for assessing the different concepts about the kingdom of Christ. However, not every occasion is appropriate for the detailed discussion of such subjects, so he would only summon the two concepts he knows. One of these claims that Christ's kingdom has not yet come and believers must keep waiting, while according to the other opinion, that kingdom is already here and now Christ is the reign of his church. The firmly non-adorantist Enyedi consoles his believers by declaring that both opinions are essentially true. There is no denial that Christ's word and his wisdom is present among the Christians, but this is not a perfect presence yet, and his second coming should be regarded as the fulfillment and perfection of this current presence. The task of the believers, nonetheless, is not to hunt the answer to such questions, but to live a life that is commendable to Christ. So, in fact, he merely actualized his probably older opinion of his, when, in a sermon, he launched a strenuous attack against those who dare to promote prophecies and predictions. The authors of the mentioned church history still had a unique copy of this sermon in their hands, where a marginal note added that the place refers to Erasmus Johannis and János Szilvási, who was to convert to Calvinism. Since this version is no longer extant, there is no way to measure the claim of the church history that the marginal note is from Enyedi himself. Enyedi, who was the bishop between 1592 and 97, of course, felt inclined and in a sense was also forced to declare his opinion, primarily in his sermons, about political matters related to Transylvania. This was just the case when the Transylvanian Principality found itself in a, without the least exaggeration, dramatic situation. As it was already mentioned today, an immense political battle emerged in 1593-94 as to whether Transylvania should join the international campaign against the Turks or should carry on with its traditional foreign politics. Many sermons show that For the bishop, the position to follow was that of the so-called pro-Turkish, or the philosopher gentleman. Some of his sermons contain only dim hints at this. However, in one sermon, he utters this opinion with the help of a detailed historical allegory. The base text for the sermon is the 21st chapter from the book of Jeremiah, where the prophet tells Zedekiah, the king of Judah, that he will not be protected against the Babylonian king Nabucodonosor, but on the contrary, he is to accept the terrible desolation of his country. Enedi draws a parallel between the current situation in Transylvania and Judah already at the beginning of his sermon. Although he does not engage in theological explications, he makes it clear that this is based on the identical relationship between God and man in the Old and the New Testament. Although the time has changed, God is the same then and now. People are almost as devout now as they were in those old times. And for the same sins, the same judge imposes the same punishment upon the wicked as in those old times. The text offers an end of quote. The text offers an exemplary explication of the sensus literalis in line with the erudition of the bishop, but instead of dwelling on this, I would like to recall the most important elements of the application. Transylvania lies among two superpowers, like Judah, which was exposed to attacks from the Egyptians and the Babylonians. Reviewing the history of the last century, Enedi explains that King Joachim is the Hungarian King Louis II, who signed a treaty with the Egyptians, that is, with the German Emperor and the Italians. However, he received no help from them, and thus Nabucodonosor, that is Suleiman, defeated him at the Battle of Mohács. He has left here, however, a ruler in the person of János Szapolyai, and the same happened at his further attack. Since the author could not identify each successive prince with the king of Judah, he turned Zedekiah into a symbol for all the successive Transylvanian princes, above all for the currently reigning Zsigmond Báthori. Like the others, he was not mentioned by name, but the following passage about Zedekiah obviously refers to him. Cite, Zedekiah was young, some 21 years old, and he would have followed the words of the prophet had not his counselors bereft him on his reason, etc. And even if he would, the Egyptian king and the surrounding people would come to his aid. The king was encouraged with such words until he indeed broke away from the Babylonian king. End of the quotation. Only at this point does Enedi begin to describe the extent of the desolation waiting for Judah and Jerusalem because of Zedekiah's disobedience and wrong decision, and then he explicitly instructs the Transylvanian prince about the steps necessary to avoid similar strikes. Besides, Nabucodonosor was pagan, and the Turk is pagan too, but as soon as the former happened to conquer the Jewish kingdom twice without flaw, from his benevolence left a king for the Jews from their own nation. Similarly, Hungary and Transylvania was in the Turk's hand, but still he left for us a king, a prince from our own nation. The former kept peace with Zedekiah. It appears that the lords of the country would be in peace with the Turk, and they might rest in their religion and their heritage alike. Nabucodonosor wished nothing but loyalty and taxes from Zedekiah. What else does the Turkish Caesar wish from us? End of quote. Then he shifts tone and carries on in an ironic manner. Aside, let us just turn back to Egypt. We already appear to feel the taste of Italian and German friendship in our mouths. By his grace, the Lord purged all the idols and the idolaters from our ranks and gave us a good land flowing with milk and honey. But let me ask, how would our body, How would our soul profit from the friendship of these idolaters? Will the Lord helpfully not let me be as Jeremiah, the prophet of the final pestilence, but will he let me praise his mercy and his miraculous deliverance? End of quote. Enyedi, who defines himself as the new Jeremiah here, acts as a proper prophet. He rejoices at the abolition of idolatry, and in this regard his arguments significantly differ from those of the pro-Turkish gentleman. Yet, his arguments were similarly ineffective, and in a short time he was forced to use the other voice of the prophet. In a series of sermons, he had to pray for God to save the Transylvanians from the yoke of the Turkish and the Tatar, quotation, who put the Christians to a misery similar to what the Jews had to suffer from the Chaldeans in the old times, end of quotation. In this context, Transylvania appears as a potential safe haven for the Hungarians who seek refuge here from the Turkish destruction in Hungary. In another place, he uses a less conventional topos and suggests that Transylvania, the little country locked among uncouth countries, is similar to Bethlehem. Maybe a little village when compared to Jerusalem, but with a massive mission, since Christ was murdered in Jerusalem, but he was born in Bethlehem. In other words, the rebirth of the true Christ is bound to happen here. Thank you for your attention.
Good. Nestled between the pages of Solomon Schweiger's travelogue chronicling his 1577 journey from Vienna to Constantinople, this woodcut image of the frontier between Christian Europe and the Muslim East seems a rather peculiar and modest representation of the most volatile and feared contact zone of 16th century Europe. The tripartite fold-out landscape depicts the Habsburg-controlled fortress of Comora on the far right, bubbles of smoke billowing from the cannons positioned along the ramparts as they salute the delegation. A fleet of 18 oared ships with flags waving above allow the Danube to carry them towards the Ottoman realm. A cluster on the far left indicates a time lapse, with the delegation's arrival at their first and most critical destination, the first encounter with the Turks. The central panel of the triptych highlights the psychological aspects of the crossing, with tufts of vegetation and the meandering lines of the choppy waters leading the eye from right to left and back again. Seen in some historiographical traditions as an open zone of continual warfare, and others as a center for cross-border correspondence, gift exchange, and chivalric spectacles, this liminal space between the two scenes serves as the focal point of the image and my research. In 1543, Sultan Suleiman took Esztergom. The ancient royal city would turn out to be the furthest fortified Ottoman fortress up the Danube, which they held securely for much of the next 150 years. While the Ottomans continued to fight pockets of resistance further south for decades, from the 1550s on, an increasingly fixed and formalized border system emerged between two portals into their respective worlds, Comora, Komarom, which is up here starred, and Gran Esztergom. The system collapsed again in the 1590s with the outbreak of the Long Turkish War, but between the 1550s and the 90s, dozens of diplomatic delegations from both sides crossed the well-worn path, alongside countless merchants, messengers, artists, craftsmen, poets, debtors, nobles, humanists, scholars, hopeful bachelors, and, as it's clear from this conference, also anti-Trinitarians. It was here that the day-to-day interactions of fortresses within striking distance of each other, meaning half-day's ride on horseback, complicated the dichotomies between East and West that have been central to the Anglo-American academic tradition in the last few decades. Ottomanized Christians, Christianized Ottomans, Slavic speakers of all ethnic backgrounds, mixed families of renegades, all forced contemporaries and modern scholars to confront the ambiguity of the in-between. In this presentation, I will examine an object, a letter, and an individual that crossed the 50-kilometer stretch between modern-day Comora and Gran during an extended period of relatively stable conditions in the second half of the 16th century. I suggest that as part of the emerging fixed border system, the subjects of two multi-ethnic empires, I'll go back to this one. The subjects of these two multi-ethnic empires, Holy Roman and Ottoman, articulated complex forms of identity as they navigated the intricate social and political webs where the Christian and Muslim worlds met. The object, a costume book produced by a traveler, reveals attempts to grapple with mixtures of costume elements as they labeled different groups and displayed material goods circulating throughout the region. The second example, a letter from a pasha to an archduke, shows how an Ottoman official expressed what he saw as the ethnic homelessness of a particular group of trouble-causing men in the border region. The last example is a traveler, whose description of his crossing shows how one man saw, understood, and commented on social divisions he encountered in the Ottoman-Habsburg contact zone. After looking closely at these three primary sources, I will briefly engage with two theoretical and historiographical strands: New Historicism's approach to identity and European encounters with the Turks as related to borderland paradigms. My central argument is simple, I hope. I'm arguing that as the two empires, Holy Roman and Ottoman, came into increasingly close contact with one another, literally backing up into each other in the second half of the 16th century after the collapse of the Kingdom of Hungary, individuals reacted to the crisis of daily encounter creatively. They sought to keep cross-border interactions under control by writing off breaches of etiquette as a result of the restlessness of a third group who were both present in and wholly separable from the Ottoman and Habsburg imperial spheres. Through this system of articulating difference that I see in the following examples participating in, individuals fashioned a productive frontier and their own place within it. In other words, though this contact zone looked a lot like a classic borderland, in reality, with vast expanses of overlapping sovereignty and double taxation, from the vantage point of the diplomatic highway between Comora and Gran, we can see an attempt by certain individuals to write and draw a frontier, a dividing line, even a buffer zone or a cushion between the two empires. What we are left with for the period that I'm looking at here is a remarkably stable and functional diplomatic system, which allowed this highway to remain open even at times of crisis. Just to illustrate the sheer volume and nature of clientele utilizing this diplomatic corridor, and I realize this is very small, but I apologize. I would like to highlight a few of the border crossers that traveled between these two portals into their respective worlds and the records they left behind. What you see here is a list of travel logs that recount the crossing from Habsburg to Ottoman lands. The first description is that of Hans Sternschwam, a Fugger merchant with a humanist education who crossed in July of 1553. The last description comes from Wenceslav Vratislav of Mitrovic, the son of a Czech nobleman, sent to accompany a delegation, whose thick description of the ceremonial aspects of the September 1591 crossing stand in stark contrast to his return through the now completely broken corridor in the middle of the long Turkish War in August of 1596. Between these two men, I know currently of 16 others who wrote descriptions of the same trip. Some, like Jacob von Betzek, recorded making the journey over a dozen times. Others kept their comments extremely short, making note of the date and perhaps the individuals present, while others relayed vivid accounts of receptions held by the Beys of Esztergom, seated in Christian chapels surrounded by crucifixion scenes, the Virgin Mary and Sibyls, this last fascinating one being Stefan Gerlach, who somebody had mentioned earlier today. In addition to these travelogues, of course, are the much-studied letters of the pashas, captains, nobles, and soldiers themselves, to which we will return in a moment as I get to the heart of the current project. But first, I would like to turn our attention to a group of objects that force us to confront the ambiguity that accompanied the mental and political shifts which informed attitudes towards clothing and images of identity. Costume books, a particular topic in recent, or popular topic in recent scholarship, which Ulinka Rublak has brilliantly explored to reevaluate ideas of Renaissance self and other. Within this tradition, one subset compiled images of the Ottoman Empire, mapping cultural stereotypes cartographically through an emphasis on place names and ethnicities in the captions. The images seen here are by Lambert de Vos, who accompanied the imperial ambassador, Karl Rim, to Constantinople in 1570 via our diplomatic corridor between Camorra and Gran. In a series of pages devoted to ethnic minorities and individuals from the provinces, he shows us, labeled in Latin underneath by his hand, 2 Moors, followed by this curious central figure that I will come back to in just a moment, who's identified as a frontier warrior. On the next page is a Jewish doctor and a companion, followed by a Kurd and an Armenian. Of course, each of these terms could be dissected, but I want to turn to this Ghazi, or knight from the frontiers, the only one from the series to lack an ethnic marker. His costume elements are filled with socio-cultural ambiguity. Along with his captivating expression, he wears a floppy hat, a type scholars identify as South Slavic or Bosnian, a leopard skin cape characteristic of certain branches of the Ottoman, Hungarian, and Polish militaries, tight European hose, heeled boots with Western European spurs, a saber, and carries a Central European wooden targe shield with a panoply of protruding feathers. We can be certain that this last element, the shield, would have been one of the myriad of objects that crossed between Camorra and Gran, an extremely common type used during jousts and ceremonial processions of hussars. Such shields as this one regularly moved across the border as tournament trophies, commissions, and effects of renegades. This added layers to the already mixed nature of fashion in 16th century and Central and Eastern Europe. Some other objects involved in this exchange of costume elements are surrounding it here on the screen. This includes luxurious textiles and embroidery, helmets, horses with sumptuous fittings, and down to individual feathers for caps that were exchanged with letters. While here, the DeVos identifies his subject as a Ghazi, or holy warrior, and thus firmly on the Ottoman side, with the benefit of a nuanced understanding of the border region, we can look back and see him as possibly a trans-imperial subject whose identity was blurred and constantly negotiated, shifting over space and time according to articulation. What is important to take away from the costume book for our purposes here is that despite the best efforts to tell individuals apart, border-crossing objects of material culture created a complicated environment that, in the case of our feathered friend, DeVos decided to leave unmarked ethnically. Turning now to our letter. On September 28, 1583, Ali Pasha of Buda wrote to his longtime correspondent and Habsburg counterpart, Archduke Ernst, responding to perennial accusations that the governors of 3 smaller districts were disrupting the peace and organizing tournaments with fortresses on the other side of the border, leading to breaches of the peace treaties ratified by both imperial centers. Following a digression into a curious offer of assistance in the form of thousands of Ottoman troops to help the Habsburgs maintain order during the emperor's recent religious problems, Ali Pasha returns again to the topic of border duels, complaining that the frontiersmen drink too much wine, send angry letters to one another, and regret it in the morning. Before closing, the Ottoman governor reflects on these difficult-to-control men. As you know, from the beginning and in the days of the kings, all of the Magyar nation belonged to Buda. Now, however, according to our laws as well as your laws, the Magyar nation belongs to us. But the current Magyar lords do not belong to Buda, nor do they belong to the Roman emperor. The letter is just one of thousands sent by the Pashas of Buda to the Habsburg archdukes and other officials in the lingua franca. Despite their use of Magyar or Hungarian, they frequently refer to these pesky men whose restless movements disrupt the peace. Ali Pasha, in the post for half of the 1580s, developed a close relationship with Ernst, son of Emperor Maximilian II, regularly exchanging gifts while politely requesting and negotiating the transport of raw materials for building projects, and even inviting him to attend his wedding. A regular complaint launched by both sides involved the control of these Magyar lords and their cross-border interactions. In reflecting on the unique position between empires, Ali Pasha points out that the Magyars are no longer tied exclusively to their lands and nation, which could belong to one city that an empire could possess, nor tied exclusively to a language which the author and recipient wielded freely. Yet despite these inconveniences of traditional identity markers, and I'm thinking here of Max Weber's government, language, and geography, the individuals somehow maintained an essential Magyar social community. Ali Pasha was not alone in launching these complaints. Mustafa Pasha, in a letter to Maximilian in 1575, also complains about the Magyars, urging the emperor to replace them with German captains in the name of peace. In 1579, Veli Pasha wrote a detailed list of 27 violations of the peace treaty committed by Hungarian lords and their soldiers. In fact, a very large portion of these letters declare that all violations are the result of Magyar actions. Occasional comments on the nature of this Hungarian identity, like the letter discussed here, are extremely rare. So how concrete was this identity, truthfully? Surely the nationalist folk songs, humanist tracts, and printed texts flowing from Transylvania and Habsburg Hungary did much to keep the memory of the former kingdom alive. But how did this function outside the presses and on the border itself? How were these webs woven? Who wove them? And where can we find the seams and holes in the fabric? So far, we've seen how a letter and a costume book commented on identity, and I now wish to return to where we began with Solomon Schweiger, a Lutheran theologian and humanist in the retinue of Joachim von Sitzendorf's Habsburg ambassador to Constantinople. In addition to his work as a preacher, he wrote one of the travelogues that narrates the crossing of the border between Comora and Gran in 1577. This woodcut from the first printing of the travelogue in 1608 by the Nuremberg printer Lanzenberger sees a defined zone of open and uninhabited territory that we should note. We cannot be sure if it was Solomon Schweiger himself who made this image. It might actually just be the printer in Nuremberg reading the text and adding the image in. So that would add another layer of the psychological understanding of how this border functioned. But as a proto-anthropologist, Schweiger's narrative is filled with commentary on the social and cultural environments he encountered during his travels. I'm going to briefly summarize his narration of his crossing, highlighting some of the ways he utilizes ethnonyms and toponyms to identify individuals and demarcate social groups. His original text will be on the screen. It's going to be very small, so you're not supposed to read it. The terms describing language or objects are going to be highlighted in pink, toponyms will be in orange, and ethnonyms in green. So Schweiger notes the presence of 24 heads of Turks stacked one on top of the other by the gate, a grisly reminder of the less friendly side of the cross-border interactions. This apparently kindled the party's appetite since they were brought deer, fish, and good Hungarian wine for breakfast, after which they met the newly appointed preacher from Tübingen. He explored the fortress and was received by a senior official from Württemberg, also noting the coat of arms of the imperial city in multiple locations. He then reflects, using ethnic terms, on the fact that the fortress is manned by a German garrison, hence every Hungarian that enters must leave their sword at the gate, presumably because they are not to be trusted. Early the following morning, the Turks send word that they were ready, and the delegation left the fortress on the boats to the sound of celebratory cannon fire behind them and the enemy ahead. After a short while, they stop their boats and disembark. A leader of the Turks, running almost at full speed with a group of young boys, reached the ambassador, promptly kissed his hand, and started conversing with him, but in Hungarian. They discussed tribute payments, then returned to the boats with the leaders of the Turks for breakfast, though the Turks were fasting, while the soldiers from both sides greeted each other as friends, acquaintances, and brothers, and spoke with each other in Hungarian, Croatian, and Turkish. All of this took place just half a German mile below Comora. 3 observations can be made about his use of terms. First, individuals are referred to by their city of origin if they're from the Holy Roman Empire, but collectively as opposed to another social group as Germans. Secondly, Turks stands as a catch-all for all of those he encounters on the Ottoman side, both individuals and groups, despite their noted diversity. And we should note here that other sources, particularly studied by Clara Hegyi, make it clear that this included very few ethnic Turks. Actually, it was mostly Southern Slavic populations that were manning the border garrisons here. And lastly, third, the languages are shared across social groups, which he makes a surprised note of quite frequently. In addition to this, the pesky Hungarians appear again not to be trusted with their swords. So in my last 10 minutes of my presentation, I wanted to turn to some recent theoretical works to help us explore these primary sources, suggesting ways in which these articulations and ambiguities might be read together. Taking cues from context-based visions of community and identity in the works of medievalist Walter Pohl, and calls to problematize the use of ethnonyms by confronting their plasticity and differing meanings over time and place by Jamal Kafedar, my aim here is not to define, but rather to show that these group identity markers were topics of reflection and diplomatic positioning. To begin with, we need a useful framework or a useful definition of the term identity. So in order to peer into inner psychological worlds in the producers of the text themselves, we should read identity as performative, constructed, and relational understanding of a person's imagined but not imaginary place within their world. Stephen Greenblatt, who I know some of you are going to go run downstairs and see as soon as I am done, in his classic Renaissance self-fashioning, argued that the rise of historical consciousness, individualism, and rationalism came with the humanist reordering of the world as it displaced the inherited social order and allowed for an unprecedented series of shifts in human consciousness to occupy the minds and pens of middle and upper class men. Recent scholarship has moved away from the great men towards men of lesser talents and means, but similar goals and preoccupations. Most importantly, scholars like Rublak, Burke, and Minsker have reinserted the centrality of communal social groups into the history of Renaissance individualism, seen once as the antithesis of the newly unveiled human consciousness. Scholars are now concentrating on revealing moments of a detectable loss of control, when events such as the Reformation turned the world upside down and threatened the collective identities that the people relied on for their self-definition. This move is typical of New Historicism, which, at its most basic level, is the comprehensive study of cultural forms in their historical context, not only embodied within specific worlds, but also how they engage with and self-consciously pull free from their environment. Though our surviving historical records for this borderland do not include trunks full of family papers and diaries like Hermann Weinsberg of Cologne, studied by Matthew London in a fantastic book recently, utilizing the analytical questions of New Historicism and identity formation offers a way for us to frame the sources we do have in a productive way, questioning the motivations behind the articulations that we've looked at. One way to do this is to see them as speech acts. Burke and Rublak both utilize the theoretical apparatus of LePage and Tabernet-Keller's 1985 book, Acts of Identity, which argues that people reveal both their personal identity and their search for social roles for themselves and others through linguistic performances, or speech acts. These articulations express not only an individual's idiosyncratic behavior as reflected in their attitudes towards groups, causes, and traditions, but also the identity of a group lies within the projections individuals make of the concepts each has about the group. Sounds complicated, but Burke takes this to the early modern period to help him discuss how polyglots perform different acts of identity according to the situation in which they find themselves, arguing that a record of the language used by an individual on a particular occasion is only a record of the identity that came to the fore on that occasion, not in any way revealing their true identity. Simply put, neither race, nor ethnic group, nor language turns out to be a clearly definable external object, but is the product of somebody labeling it as such for a specific purpose. Bringing it back to our sources, we might see the Pasha's insistence on referring to the Magyar violators of the peace treaty as deliberate positioning of a group external to his own when it's convenient for him. Rublak uses the theoretical frame to discuss visual acts, combining it with other theories about hitting images that are forceful and capture emotions, to suggest that costume elements and costume books worked in the same way. The act of dressing was thus a part of the symbolic toolkit through which people could acquire and communicate attitudes towards life and construct visual realities in relation to others. This might help us reevaluate costume books seeking to identify and fix appropriate national costumes along the border, a project I've worked on before. Rather than record the differences between them, they create the difference by defining them. De Vos, then, was cautious not to attach an ethnic marker to his confusing border holy warrior. Before concluding, I'd like to tie these primary sources to one more historiographical tradition: European encounters with the Turks and its relationship with borderlands paradigms. Thus, finally getting to my strange title again. The term frontier has been defined as that which divides societies from one another, while the term borderland has been defined as a more dynamic model with overlapping areas where two societies meet. Ottomanist scholars generally agree that the borderlands model is the best way to explore contact zones for the Ottoman case, particularly in the northern region. Many have attempted to abandon the frontier model itself altogether. But if we read the borderlands through much of the 16th century humanist rhetoric on the Turk, we are confronted with a strand of literature relating to Piccolomini's identification of first Hungary, then Poland as the bulwark of Christianity, the Antemurale Christianitatis. While a majority of scholarship remains in the works of Italian and occasionally German interpretations of these concepts, including Margaret Meserve's Empires of Islam and Renaissance Historical Thought, and Bezaha's Creating East and West. Recently, Lissy Wagner has published a book, Islam, Christianity, and the Making of Czech Identity, that shows how fruitful it can be to look for signs of these humanist currents in vernacular Czech literature. So what if we combine these approaches with our primary sources from the Ottoman Habsburg frontier? I do not mean to suggest that the Pashas were playing into humanist rhetoric consciously, but then again, maybe they were. So by way of conclusion, I would like to offer this interpretation of these sources again. I should note here that this project is still in its early stages, and I do not mean to suggest that a real Hungarian identity did not exist. On the contrary, I think it was powerful and deeply connected to language and memory. But I think it's fruitful to question this identity and to ask why people use the terms they use every time to uncover their motivations. I've argued that the costume book of Lambert de Vos attempts to pinpoint the identity of a mounted man whose mixed costume elements seem impossible to reconcile with one tradition. The letter from Ali Pasha of Buda to Archduke Ernst is the strongest articulation, part of the diplomatic positioning along the borders to maintain peaceful relations amid small skirmishes. He creates a buffered frontier. Solomon Schweiger's travelogue picks up on this diplomatic positioning and adds his own layer of complexity. Through these articulations, we see the inner workings of one important aspect of the remarkably stable diplomatic system that dominated the second half of the 16th century. Thank you.